Hey, I'm Tamara Kandaker, and you're listening to The Decibel from the Globe and Mail. So there's about a week and a half to go until Election Day, and tonight is the first and last English language debate. And if you haven't been paying attention until now, it's probably a good time to start. Leaders' debates don't usually move the needle that much, but this time could be different, given what the polls are suggesting. According to the latest, the Conservatives and Liberals are tied, and the NDP's support has gone up to about 20%. And the debate could be one of the last chances for the party leaders, Liberal leader Justin Trudeau, Conservative leader Erin O'Toole, and NDP leader Jagmeet Singh, to say something to change the direction of the race.
I'll be watching for how effectively Justin Trudeau attacks Erin O'Toole. I'll be watching for how effectively Erin O'Toole defends against those attacks. And I'll be watching for how effectively Jagmeet Singh convinces progressive voters that they should come over and stay with him.
John Ibbitson is writer-at-large for The Globe, a longtime political columnist, and he's been on the campaign trail with the Conservatives. John is back on the show today, and we're going to talk about a lot of things, like what's going wrong for the Liberals and whether with under 2 weeks left they can turn things around, why Erin O'Toole is exceeding expectations, and what the NDP could do to make the most of the opportunity in front of them. You're listening to The Decibel. Hi, John. How's it going?
Good morning. Well, thanks. Yourself?
Good. The last time we talked, it was before Trudeau called the election, and you were predicting that he was going to do it because the Liberals thought that they could get a majority and that this is like the perfect time to hold an election. And it's obviously not gone the way that they hoped it would. And how much trouble are the Liberals in right now? And just give me a snapshot of what the polls are saying and where we're at as of today.
The Liberals are in a lot of trouble. At the beginning of the election campaign, they were on the cusp of majority government territory in the mid to upper 30s. They just needed a couple more percentage points and they would get their majority government. But it was clear that the voters were angry at an election being called in the middle of a pandemic with the situation collapsing in Afghanistan. The election was not seen as necessary, and they promptly began to lose support. And they have gone from mid to upper 30s to the low 30s, which is where they were on election night 2019. And so when we say that the Liberals are at 32%, we mean that pollsters say that 32% of the people they reach say that they would vote for the Liberals if an election were held today.
And just tell me about how their numbers compare to that of the Conservatives and the NDP.
The Conservatives at the beginning of the election campaign were swooning. Some polls had them falling below 30%. It looked as though they were losing their core vote. But that has all come back and then some. Erin O'Toole has been an effective leader in this campaign. The party launched a 160-page platform. It has many progressive measures in it for workers, for healthcare, a plan to fight climate change that is considered credible and it puts a price on carbon. And he has brought the Conservative fortunes up to, guess what, about where they were in the 2019 election. The NDP, on the other hand, has shown significant improvement. They got 16% of the vote 2 years ago. They're up around 20 now. That would translate into a substantial increase in the number of seats for Jagmeet Singh, who is really enjoying himself in this election campaign.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I'm always really reluctant to talk about polls because they're a snapshot in time, and there have been times, in recent memory when polls have been very wrong. And I wonder how you think about them and how seriously we should take these polls right now.
Well, you're right. Polls have had a poor record in some elections, both in Canada and in the United States, federally and provincially. We have in Nick Nanos, perhaps the most credible pollster in the country, certainly one of the most credible. He's using a rolling average, so he polls every single day, and then each day, one day is dropped off and one day added, so you get a consistent trend line. And so while I think it is certainly fair to say that any given poll on any given day could be an outlier, could be misreading voters' intentions, the better polls overall are giving us an accurate sounding of where the election is at. In terms of the attitudes of voters, but there is a wild card, and there's especially a wild card in this election. Who will actually turn out to vote? And will the electorate that turns out to vote end up being the same as the general electorate?
So you say that the Liberals have lost support partly because people are angry that he's called an election at this time. And how do we actually know that that's the case?
Pollsters tell us that when they ask people, why are you voting the way you're voting? Those who are switching their votes away from the Liberals to other parties say that they're angry the election was called unnecessarily in the middle of a pandemic, that we did not need to be going to the polls even as the Delta variant is resulting in more cases.
Right. And you mentioned that meanwhile, Erin O'Toole is exceeding expectations, and you spent the weekend with him. You've been on the campaign trail with him. So tell me what that's been like and what he's been like.
He has been remarkably effective on the campaign trail. He's something that both Stephen Harper and Andrew Scheer, the two previous Conservative leaders, weren't. He's an extrovert. He likes crowds. I watched him in Nanaimo at a rally on the weekend. And after the formal part was over, he spent 40 minutes just hanging out with people, taking selfies, talking to supporters. That is a huge asset in a politician and one we've never seen before in a Conservative.
Right. But Erin O'Toole's increased popularity as leader hasn't really translated yet to the Conservatives actually making gains, right?
No, Erin O'Toole is about as popular as Justin Trudeau is now, and Justin Trudeau is not all that popular. And we're less than 2 weeks out from the vote.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned that Erin O'Toole introduced a progressive policy platform. Tell me a bit more about that. How is it progressive compared to previous Conservative platforms, and why is it helping him, do you think?
The platform is surprisingly progressive. It has major increases to funding in healthcare. It has a climate change program that puts a price on carbon, something the Conservatives said they would never do. It has supports for workers' rights. There's, for example, a portable pension plan for gig workers so that when you're working on a contract, the employer has to pay pension and employment insurance benefits, and those benefits go with you when you move from one job to another job. That's going to be very attractive to workers in the precariat, those who are moving and working from gig to gig.
But Erin O'Toole has flip-flopped on things like gun control and the price on carbon, and there are those who feel like he's been a bit of a political chameleon, and I wonder whether that's being lost and how this flip-flopping is being seen by voters.
Certainly, Erin O'Toole displays a political flexibility that his predecessors lacked. Stephen Harper, for example, and Andrew Scheer tended to get hung up on policies that then cost them support among the general electorate. I'm thinking, for example, of Stephen Harper cutting funding to the arts in 2008. That hurt him badly in Quebec, but he wouldn't back down from it. Erin O'Toole found himself in trouble last weekend because the Conservative platform says that some restricted weapons would be unrestricted if he came to power, and the Liberals began hammering him over that. He quickly reversed himself and said all existing restrictions will remain in place while we conduct a public inquiry. Did that show a lack of political conviction? Yes. Did it show political flexibility, tactical flexibility in pursuit of political power? Yes, it's why I said in one column that his political flexibility in pursuit of power makes Erin O'Toole the most liberal leader the Conservatives have ever had. I meant that as a compliment.
What kind of voter do you think Erin O'Toole and the Conservatives are going for right now?
Well, of course, they're going for the traditional base voter, rural voters in the prairie provinces, voters who worry about excessive government spending. Mr. O'Toole will balance the budget, he says, although he'll take a decade to do it. But he's also going after the kind of voter that Boris Johnson successfully went after in the United Kingdom, the worker who feels unsure about where the next job is coming from if they're on contract, the worker who's worried about the export of jobs to low-wage markets overseas. These voters traditionally are owned by the NDP or the Liberals, but Conservatives are increasingly identifying them as potential Conservative voters. And it's clear that Erin O'Toole, with things like the portable workers' pensions program, is going after those voters and trying to take them away from the Liberals and the NDP. Will it work? Well, we'll see.
So just going back to the Liberals and how they've lost support, where is that support going?
Well, that's the interesting thing. The support that the Liberals are losing, they are not losing to the Conservatives. As I said, both parties are essentially back where they were in the 2019 election. Only the NDP is improving in its popular vote. That suggests that people are not switching between the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party. They're switching between the Liberal Party and the New Democratic Party.
Right. And why do you think Liberal voters are switching to the NDP?
I think there are a lot of progressive voters who are disappointed with Justin Trudeau. The hope and change of 2015 has become a bit more cynical, a bit more tactical. The government has, I think, performed impressively in fighting the pandemic, but it has not met all of its commitments. For example, in bringing potable water to reserves, in the progressive agenda towards women, towards vulnerable minorities. And I think, generally speaking, after 6 years in power, there may just be a sense of weariness with Mr. Trudeau, just as there was a weariness with Stephen Harper towards the end of his years in power.
Is it possible, do you think, that because of the kinds of policies that the Liberals introduced during the pandemic, like the CERB, for example, people are now more comfortable voting for a more progressive party like the NDP?
I think we live in progressive times. I think the point you make is a very good one. The pandemic has scared people. The idea that government has to live within its means, that we have to keep under tight control, that we mustn't allow government to get too big, all that's been shoved aside as we rely on big government to get us through the worst crisis we've had since the Second World War, which we rely on big government to protect workers, to protect the economy, and to protect our health. So one of the reasons that Erin O'Toole has released a pretty progressive platform is that he realizes that we live right now in pretty progressive times. And the reason that the Liberals may be losing support to the NDP is that the NDP is more progressive even than the Liberals, and people are moving in a progressive direction.
How big do you think the opportunity is right now for Jagmeet Singh and his party?
He has a substantial opportunity to improve his vote, adding maybe a dozen seats or so to the 24 that he already has. But that could be hugely significant. In the last parliament, the Liberals could draw on either the support of the Conservatives or the support of the New Democrats or the support of the Bloc Québécois in order to get legislation passed. If the NDP brings its vote up into the mid-30s in terms of seat count, and if it's a minority government, then Jagmeet Singh could hold all the cards. He could decide whether the Liberals or the Conservatives form government, and he could decide whether the Liberals or the Conservatives stay in government. Mm-hmm. The Bloc Québécois might not have enough seats to work as a kingmaker on its own. That could make Jagmeet Singh's position in Parliament really quite impressive if the vote holds until Election Day.
Right. So this is potentially a huge opportunity for the NDP. And what do you think Jagmeet Singh has to do at this point to make the most of it?
I think Jagmeet Singh has to remain credible. He has to convince voters that it's not a case of a vote for the NDP is a vote for the big bad Conservatives. He has tactically not attacked Erin O'Toole very much at all. He has focused all his fire on Justin Trudeau. Daryl Bricker of Ipsos Public Affairs says that Jagmeet Singh is the most effective litigator of the Trudeau record. He means by that even more than Mr. O'Toole, Mr. Singh has done a good job of convincing progressives that the Liberals are not as progressive as they claim to be, and that those progressive voters should come to the NDP if they want to see real change, for example, in areas like pharmacare.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so just going back to the Liberals, they must be pretty stunned by what's happening. And how are they responding to the polls? How is their approach changing?
Well, the Liberals are responding as they always respond when they find themselves in trouble, which is to go on the attack against the Conservatives. So we started this campaign with, forward together, build back better, whatever the Liberal slogan was. I can't even remember now. Now the Liberal slogan is Erin O'Toole is evil. Conservatives are evil. A vote for Jagmeet Singh is a vote for Erin O'Toole. A vote for Erin O'Toole is a vote for evil, for a kind of Canada you don't want, for a big bad Canada that would attack a woman's right to choose, for a Canada that would abandon its commitments to global warming, for on and on and on.
Yeah, and where are we seeing this kind of rhetoric? Is it in their campaign ads? Is it in Trudeau's speeches on the campaign trail?
Well, it's certainly campaign ads, which have gone very negative.
Let's take back Canada.
Erin O'Toole says he wants to take Canada back. He also says he'll repeal the Liberal ban on assault weapons. He has promised to scrap the Liberal plan for mandatory vaccines on planes and trains. He'll bring privatized healthcare and let his MPs vote against a woman's right to choose.
And look, Justin Trudeau has been dogged by extreme right-wing anti-vax protesters in the last couple of weeks. And it's gotten pretty ugly. They are clearly trying to associate those protesters with Erin O'Toole. There is zero evidence of that. And Erin O'Toole has condemned the protests and the protesters forcibly.
But I guess what Trudeau's been saying about O'Toole and the anti-vaxxers, what I've heard is him say that he hasn't taken a hard enough stance on vaccination because he's trying to cater to these kinds of voters. And what do you make of that?
Again, it is an effective attack. The Conservatives believe, because they're Conservatives, that we should encourage people to be vaccinated. We should inform them. We should answer their doubts. We should make the vaccines available to them. But we should not punish or prohibit because people make particular health choices. That is contrary to where the polls say most Canadians are at. Most Canadians really wish the unvaccinated would get vaccinated. And most Canadians are prepared to limit the rights of the unvaccinated to go into restaurants and bars, to go to sporting events, even to go into work, unless and until they become vaccinated. Now, if anything, those protesters appear to be aligned with Maxime Bernier's PPC party. He's a former Conservative, almost won the Conservative leadership, but he left the party and formed his own party. It's anti-immigrant and it's now anti-vax. And you see more and more PPC signs showing up at these really angry protests at Justin Trudeau.
At this point, we've seen them also go as far as throwing gravel at him, and you've been on the campaign trail, and I wonder what kind of impact this is having on the race, if any. How different is the feeling on the campaign trail with these protesters? Like, you've covered a lot of campaigns. Is this really different?
The protests are really different. You're right. I've covered my fair share of protests during election campaigns, but they're usually left-wing protesters protesting Conservative politicians. Mike Harris, when he was Premier of Ontario, faced a lot of protesters in the 1990s. Usually it is social activists, climate change activists, protesting Conservative politicians. And they do so loudly, but they do so respectfully and from a distance, for the most part. But this is very different. First of all, this is extreme right-wing, anti-vax, anti-government, anti-science protesters in the sense of visceral anger, of rage against the machine. It's like nothing I've ever seen before. It is close, it is personal, and it appears sometimes to be at the risk of becoming violent. I think it's not something we can welcome in Canadian politics at all, but it's something that we may have to get used to.
So do you think the Liberals have severely miscalculated this? And is there any chance that they could turn things around in the next couple of weeks and actually get a majority like they'd planned to?
It would have to be a bombshell. They would need to have something in their quiver that they've been holding back, some horribly compromising revelation about Erin O'Toole that would shock voters in the way that the photographs of Mr. Trudeau's blackface shocked voters in the 2019 campaign. The Liberals were covered from that, but at least to a minority government. But they are not going to get a majority in this election unless they can find something equally outrageous and shocking.
So people are going to be listening to this probably the day of the only English language debate, the last one before we head to the polls. And what are you going to be watching?
I'll be watching for how effectively Justin Trudeau attacks Erin O'Toole. I'll be watching for how effectively Erin O'Toole defends against those attacks. And I'll be watching for how effectively Jagmeet Singh convinces progressive voters that they should come over and stay with him.
At this point, what do you think are the defining issues of this election? Because I'm definitely having a hard time figuring that out, because this whole discussion about gun control seems pretty random. Like, I would think that the defining issues would be, how do we get out of this pandemic and climate change, that's the stuff that's top of people's minds right now.
Sure. Healthcare is top of people's minds. Climate change is top of people's minds. The pandemic, economic security is top of people's minds. And the two parties have different and credible responses to all of those major issues. But I think 10 days out, the election may be devolving into, who do you trust to mind the store? Do you want Justin Trudeau to lead this country for the next 2 or 4 years, or do you want Erin O'Toole? It may be just down to a question of the popularity of the leadership. Neither one of those two leaders is showing impressive gains in the trust that voters are prepared to bestow on them. But the sense I get is that this is no longer an issue about childcare or an issue about climate change or an issue about healthcare funding. It's really just an issue about who is the most trustworthy, or even who is the least untrustworthy leader.
Okay, John, thank you so much for this. Really appreciate it.
It's been a pleasure.
All right, that's it for today. I'm Tamara Kendacker. Our producers are Madeline White and Kasia Mihailovich. David Crosby edits the show, and Angela Pacenza is our executive editor. Thank you so much to John Ibbitson. You can find John on Twitter at John Ibbitson. If you want to email us, you can reach us at thedecibel@globeandmail.com. If you want to reach me, I'm on Twitter at Anima_TK. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.